Gideon Hart only wanted to buy cheap land to reopen his garage, but behind the crumbling estate sat 11 dust-covered classic cars and 2 forgotten aircraft. A week later, a convoy of black vehicles stopped at the gate. CEO Celeste Ashford Sterling stepped into the hangar, ready to declare the entire collection belonged to her family. Then she saw the silver emblem beneath the wing of the first plane and went completely still. That was the aircraft her father was supposed to have died in 18 years ago. If it had never crashed, what had really happened to him? Stay until the end to find out what secret buried beneath this estate could cost the CEO her entire empire. The notice had been posted in the county property listings for 3 weeks, and in that time, not a single serious bidder had come forward. Greyhaven Estate sat on 47 acres of overgrown Virginia countryside, its main house sporting a collapsed section of roof, windows boarded since the previous decade, and a driveway so cracked and heaved by tree roots that the auction agent had warned attendees to park at the gate and walk in. The property records showed a disputed ownership history stretching back nearly 2 decades. A chain of holding companies that had dissolved one by one until nothing remained but the land itself and whatever still sat on it. Most people who drove past turned around without getting out of their cars, and the estate had a reputation that real estate professionals described as complicated and that local historians described as cursed. None of that discouraged Gideon Hart, mostly because he was not looking for a trophy property or a weekend retreat. Gideon was 42 years old, a single father, and a restoration mechanic whose entire professional life had been built inside a concrete block garage he had rented for 11 years on the western Fairfax County. He restored classic automobiles, taking on commissions from collectors who valued patience and precision over speed, and he had built something real inside those rented walls: a clientele, a reputation, lift, and a press, and a parts inventory accumulated carefully over a decade. Then his landlord sold the parcel to a regional development group, and the letter arrived giving him 90 days to vacate. The search for comparable space turned up nothing within his budget that could hold a lift, a spray booth, and the kind of electrical load that serious restoration work required. And every county auction he attended ended with a number he could not make work. Greyhaven appeared in his search feed on a Tuesday evening. He read the listing twice, pulled the county parcel map, and drove out the following morning to walk the fence line. The main house was worse than the photographs suggested, and the photographs had not been flattering. The roof collapsed in one section, the garden long gone feral, the stone pathways buckled and barely visible under sumac and Virginia creeper. What the listing did not adequately convey was that the rear of the property, beyond the garden and through a stand of mature oaks, contained a large metal structure that the property description called a storage outbuilding. Gideon stood at the edge of the trees and looked at the shape of it and thought it was considerably larger than the word outbuilding implied. The auction terms were explicit: the property sold as is, including all fixtures, structures, and personal property not previously itemized for removal by the prior ownership. Gideon called his bank that afternoon. His daughter Piper was 11 years old and had her father's habit of examining problems from every angle before forming an opinion. She studied the photographs on his laptop that evening with the focused expression she reserved for things she considered genuinely serious, moving through the exterior shots and the few interior images the auction agent had managed before concluding the building was too deteriorated for safe access. She asked how many rooms there were, how long the drive would be to her school, and whether the roof was the kind of broken that let rain in or the kind that might come down. Gideon answered her honestly on all 3 counts. She asked if he was sure about this, and he said he was not entirely sure about anything, except that they needed a new place before the end of the month, and that this was the only option left that fit inside the numbers. Piper thought about that for a moment, and then said she supposed a house with a bad roof was better than a garage with no roof at all. Gideon agreed that it was, and used the rest of his savings and the last of a credit line to place the winning bid the following Thursday morning at a courthouse auction, where he and a distressed-looking probate attorney were the only people present. He paid less for 47 acres and a Victorian estate than most people in the county paid for a used pickup truck. The first afternoon at Greyhaven, after he had cleared enough debris from the back door to get it open and confirmed that the main house structure was sound, even if the roof was not, Gideon walked the property perimeter and then followed the path through the oaks toward the large outbuilding he had noticed from the fence line. The rolling door on the eastern face had been padlocked, but the lock was a standard commercial unit that had rusted through at the shackle, and it came away with a firm pull. The door ran on a track that had bent slightly with age and required both hands and his full weight to shift, metal grinding against metal in the quiet of the overgrown property. What lay inside made him stop moving entirely. Beneath the high ceiling of a space large enough to hold 6 vehicles comfortably, row after row of canvas covers draped over low, angular shapes, each one resting on a concrete floor, swept clean of the leaf litter and grime he might have expected. Someone had cared for this space. Someone had locked it and left it, and cared enough to seal the gaps in the walls before walking away. Gideon reached out and pulled the cover from the nearest shape, and what he saw underneath was a low-slung coupe with bodywork formed by hand, its lines so particular and deliberate that he knew immediately it had never come off an assembly line. He spent the next 2 days working through the outbuilding systematically, lifting covers, recording serial numbers, checking frame stamps, and taking photographs that grew more extensive with each successive vehicle. The collection was not the result of someone buying whatever came to auction. Every car in the building shared a structural logic, a common design language that evolved visibly from one machine to the next, the way a sketchbook evolves when the same hand works through the same idea across dozens of pages. The earliest cars used conventional materials and conventional engineering, excellent work from their era, but nothing that would have stopped a knowledgeable collector cold. But the series progressed. By the 5th car in the sequence, the frame construction had shifted to techniques Gideon recognized from aerospace fabrication rather than automotive manufacturing, lighter alloys in non-critical panels, a composite bracing in the firewall and the transmission tunnel. By the 9th, the engine architecture had changed entirely, incorporating a fuel delivery system that looked 2 decades ahead of anything in production at the time these vehicles had apparently been built. The frame stamps confirmed what the design progression suggested. These were not a dozen different cars. They were a single program, documented in metal, each chassis numbered in sequence from A01 through A11. Sterling Quinn arrived on the 3rd morning, summoned by Gideon's call the night before. Quinn was in his 60s, silver-haired, meticulous in a way that extended to his clothing and his vocabulary, and he had spent 40 years authenticating rare automobiles and vintage aircraft for insurers, estates, and collectors of significant means. He walked the row of vehicles without speaking for nearly 20 minutes, crouching to examine frame welds, peering into engine bays, running a penlight along suspension geometry that made him inhale sharply at least twice. When he finally straightened and turned to Gideon, his expression was not the professional neutrality Quinn usually wore as a kind of armor. It was something closer to careful. He said that a single one of the later cars in the sequence, properly documented and brought to condition, would draw competitive interest from collectors operating in the 7-figure range. He said the series as a complete set, if the provenance could be established clearly, represented a category of historical artifact that transcended standard automotive valuation. Gideon said he appreciated that, and asked Quinn to keep the assessment between them until he had a clearer picture of what he actually owned. Quinn agreed without hesitation, and then said there was one more thing he had noticed. The 11th car in the sequence, the most sophisticated of the group, had a folded piece of paper tucked beneath the driver's seat. Gideon unfolded it carefully and found a hand-drawn map of the property, detailed enough to show the outbuilding, the main house, the garden, and the tree line with accuracy. At the far edge of the map, beyond a second stand of trees that Gideon had not yet reached, was a rectangular structure marked with a small symbol he did not immediately recognize, a 5-pointed star inside a circle, drawn in pencil with a precise hand. Below the symbol, 3 words: "Follow the sequence." Quinn looked at the map over Gideon's shoulder and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said that if the sequence led where he thought it might lead, Gideon ought to document everything before he opened anything else. Gideon folded the map, put it in his jacket pocket, and walked toward the tree line. The structure he found on the other side was longer and lower than the car outbuilding, its roof profile designed to accommodate something with a wingspan, and its main door was secured not with a padlock, but with a steel plate bolted across the frame, stamped with the same silver star symbol from the map. Gideon removed the bolt plate carefully, photographing it before and after, and slid the door back on tracks that moved more smoothly than anything else on the property, as though the hardware had been maintained with deliberate care even as everything around it was allowed to deteriorate. The hangar interior was dim until he found the ventilation panels along the upper wall and swung them open, letting in the gray morning light in long parallel bands that fell across the concrete floor and the 2 aircraft resting side by side at the center of the space. The first was a single-engine propeller aircraft painted in matte silver, its lines clean and slightly unconventional in the way that experimental designs often were, the fuselage slightly longer than standard, the wing root blended into the body with a care that production aircraft rarely received. The second was unfinished, its aluminum skin partly fitted and partly bare frame, components laid out along the hangar wall with the organized patience of someone who had every intention of returning to complete the work. Gideon walked slowly around the first aircraft, noting its condition, finding it far better preserved than anything else on the property, despite nearly 2 decades of sealed storage. The tires had flattened and the rubber was cracked, but the airframe showed no corrosion along the control surfaces, no delamination at the skin seams, no evidence of the kind of neglect that should have been inevitable after so long. He crouched beneath the left wing and found what he was looking at with the penlight, a small plate riveted to the underside of the wing spar, bearing a model designation stamped in silver, A12. Below it, in smaller characters, a 5-pointed star inside a circle, identical to the symbol on the map and on the hangar door. Gideon stood and walked back to the nose of the aircraft, where a data plate on the firewall listed the manufacturer as Ashford Sterling Experimental Division, a designation he had seen before on the frame stamps of several cars in the adjacent outbuilding. He photographed everything, including the partial aircraft and the components laid along the wall, and sent the photographs to Quinn that evening with a note asking whether any of the machinery matched anything in the authenticated Ashford Sterling catalog. Quinn's reply came within the hour. It contained no text, only a screenshot of a news article from 18 years prior, a photograph of a silver single-engine experimental aircraft identical to the one now parked in Gideon's newly acquired hangar, with a caption identifying the aircraft as the one lost with its pilot, Ashford Sterling Industries founder Preston Ashford Sterling, in a test flight over open water from which no body was ever recovered. Someone had photographed that article and sent it to a staff member at the auction company, and by the following morning the image had circulated widely enough that the front gates of Greyhaven Estate had a visitor. Celeste Ashford Sterling arrived in a three-vehicle convoy, two black SUVs bracketing a silver executive sedan, and she stepped out of the sedan alone before her security team had time to open the door for her. She was 37 years old, dressed with the kind of understated precision that communicated authority without requiring ornamentation, and she walked up the gravel drive toward Gideon with the measured stride of someone accustomed to entering rooms that other people had arranged in her honor. Behind her came Garrett Blackwood, the Ashford Sterling General Counsel, carrying a portfolio and wearing the expression of a man who had already decided how this conversation would end. The legal team that followed was composed of three individuals whose suits collectively cost more than Gideon's truck. Gideon met them at the front door of the main house, where he had set up a folding table and two chairs, and he offered coffee, which Garrett declined for the group with a practiced smile. Celeste spoke first, and she spoke without preamble. She explained that Greyhaven Estate had belonged to a family holding structure established by her father, that the dissolution of that structure over the subsequent years had been the result of administrative errors that had not been caught in time to prevent the property from falling into the distressed sale pipeline, and that the collection of vehicles and aircraft on the property constituted family assets that had never legally been transferred to the estate in the first place. Garrett produced a brief outlining the legal theory, along with an offer, full reimbursement of whatever Gideon had paid at auction, plus a settlement figure that he presented with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to presenting numbers that ended conversations. Gideon looked at the brief, turned to the settlement figure, set both documents down, and said he appreciated the offer but was not in a position to sign anything before he understood what he was actually signing away. Celeste's expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, a compression at the corners of her eyes that people who knew her well would have recognized as the early warning sign of impatience. She said that she was not here to negotiate the contents of a storage facility, and that the vehicles and aircraft were not part of the auction inventory because they had never been legally part of the estate. Gideon said that the auction terms stated the property sold as is and included all personal property not previously itemized for separate removal, and that no itemization had been filed. Garrett started to speak, and Gideon said he had read the statute. There was a silence. Celeste looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read, and then she asked if she could see the hangar. Gideon said yes, and led them there himself, walking through the trees with the general counsel and the security team spreading out behind him like a formal procession through the overgrown grounds of a place that was still figuring out whether it had a new owner or not. The car outbuilding he showed them first because it was closer, and because he wanted to watch how Celeste moved through it. She walked the row of covered vehicles with a focused quiet, pausing at the third car long enough to read the frame stamp, and at the ninth long enough to look at Gideon rather than the car. He could see her doing arithmetic that she had not expected to be doing in this particular building on this particular morning. She asked no questions in the car outbuilding. When they reached the hangar and he slid the door back, she walked in ahead of her own people, and she walked directly to the silver aircraft as though she already knew where it would be parked. She stood at the wing for a long time without speaking. The morning light came through the ventilation panels in the same diagonal bands Gideon had seen on his first visit, and they fell across the silver fuselage, and the woman standing beneath it with one hand raised, but not quite touching the wing surface, as though she was not yet prepared to confirm by touch what her eyes were telling her. Garrett said something from behind her, something about having the aircraft assessed before drawing conclusions, and she did not appear to hear him. Gideon stayed near the door. He had learned over a long career of handling other people's valuable objects that there were moments when the right thing was to leave space. Celeste lowered herself carefully to one knee on the concrete floor, and with the controlled precision of someone who had been trained to manage her reactions in public, she examined the plate beneath the left wing. She read the designation aloud, barely above a whisper. A12. The star in the circle. She stayed in that position for a moment. That was long enough to make Garrett shift his weight uncomfortably, and then she rose without using her hands and turned to face the room. She told them what she knew about this aircraft in the flat, precise cadence of someone reciting from memory a document they had memorized long ago under circumstances they had never chosen. The official investigation had concluded that the aircraft designated A-12 had gone down over open water 18 years prior during a solo test flight conducted by her father, Preston Ashford Sterling. The wreckage had never been fully recovered. The conditions had been cited as a factor, along with the remote location of the flight path. A formal death certificate had been issued, the estate had been settled, and the company that Preston had founded had passed to the board of directors under the interim stewardship of her uncle, Vaughn Holloway Sterling, who had guided it until Celeste had been old enough and experienced enough to take the chief executive role. She had known the aircraft's designation code since she was 19 years old. She had grown up with the story of its loss the way children grow up with certain facts about the world, as unquestioned background, as the immovable architecture of how things were. The aircraft in front of her had the same designation, the same star emblem, the data plate from her father's experimental division, and the maintenance log numbers that Brielle Dawson, the Ashford Sterling aerospace engineer who had come with the convoy, confirmed after 15 minutes, with a flashlight and a reference database on her tablet, did not match any known duplicate chassis. Garrett suggested calmly that Preston Turf might have built two aircraft with the same designation, a possibility Brielle said was technically possible, but procedurally inconsistent with how the division cataloged its experimental work, since duplicate designations were specifically prohibited under the division's own protocols. Gideon had been listening to all of this from the door, and now he walked to the cockpit and said he had found something else on his first inspection that he had not mentioned to anyone. From the seat pocket on the pilot's side, he produced a clear evidence bag he had sealed the day before, containing a wristwatch engraved on the back with initials and a date, and below the watch, a gear-shaped key unlike anything in a standard automotive or aeronautical catalog. Celeste looked at the watch from across the aircraft without touching the bag and said the initials were her father's. She said the date was the year she was born. The gear-shaped key did not fit any lock Gideon had found in the hangar or the car outbuilding. He and Brielle spent an hour going through both buildings systematically while Celeste sat in a folding chair outside the hangar, and Garrett made calls that he walked away from the group to conduct. Quinn drove out and brought his own reference materials, and said the key profile suggested a proprietary lock mechanism rather than anything manufactured commercially, the kind of fitting that an engineer would commission specifically so it could not be duplicated without knowing the source. The main house was the logical next location to search, and Gideon led the group through the boarded front entrance and into the interior, which smelled of old wood and cool plaster, and the particular stillness that settles into abandoned buildings like sediment over many years. The ground floor rooms were empty except for what water damage had left behind, but the library at the back of the house was different. Its built-in shelving was intact, the books long gone but the shelf structure itself solid, and when Gideon ran his hand along the section of shelving that faced the exterior wall, he found the frame did not have the same acoustic density as the rest. He pressed along the vertical rail until he felt the mechanism, and the section of shelving released and swung inward on a pivot that had been engineered with more precision than anything else in the deteriorating house. Behind the false shelf was a staircase, wooden, steep, descending into a space that the house's original construction plans would have listed as a root cellar if they had listed it at all. The air that came up from below was cooler and drier than the house above, and when Gideon found the mechanical light switch on the wall beside the first step, the fluorescent fixtures below came to life one by one, buzzing quietly and casting a steady white light across a room that looked nothing like a root cellar. The space was perhaps 12 by 20 feet, its walls fitted with metal shelving units holding rolled drawings and bound technical binders, and at the center of the room stood a console that looked like the control station for a small industrial process. Multiple instrument panels, switches in labeled rows, a mechanical display screen that showed a series of fields waiting for input. The fields were labeled with alphanumeric prompts, 13 in total, running down the left side of the display. Gideon counted them twice, 13 prompts, 11 cars, 2 aircraft. The sequence, the map had said. Follow the sequence. He understood then what the cars were. They were not a collection. They were a combination lock, each one a digit in a code, their frame numbers together forming the input that unlocked whatever Preston Ashford Sterling had built this room to protect. Celeste came down the stairs behind him and stood at the edge of the room, taking in the console and the binders and the rolled drawings without speaking. Delaney Brooks, the estate and probate attorney Gideon had called the previous evening on Quinn's recommendation, arrived at the property within the hour and moved through the underground room with the deliberate care of someone who understood that every object in it was simultaneously evidence and potential liability. She established a documentation protocol before anyone touched anything and told Garrett Blackwood in a tone that was polite and completely inflexible that any transfer of materials would require a chain of custody process she was personally overseeing. Garrett said the materials were proprietary assets of Ashford Sterling Industries. Delaney said that was one interpretation, and that the court would likely find the question interesting. The first binder Gideon opened contained flight plans and navigational logs, and the final entry was dated 1 week before Preston's disappearance, with a margin note in small, unhurried handwriting. A-12 transferred to secondary site. Departure confirmed. Let someone else fly the wrong one. Brielle worked through the night with the technical binders, cross-referencing the maintenance logs and the engineering notes against the Ashford Sterling Division records she could access remotely. By early morning, she had enough to say with the kind of measured certainty that engineers preferred to certainty itself that the aircraft documented in the binders as the one lost in the accident was not the A-12 prototype. It was a test frame designated T-07, an earlier airframe that had been used for structural load testing and had subsequently been modified to carry the A-12 designation on its data plates. The modification had been performed at the company's restricted facility, documented in an internal order, signed by the division's operations director at the time. That director had been Vaughn Holloway Sterling. Garrett said immediately that Vaughn had signed hundreds of operational orders during that period, and that a single authorization was not evidence of intent. Brielle said she was aware, and that she was also looking at the maintenance log for T-07, which showed it had been fueled and prepared for flight on the morning of Preston's disappearance by a crew that had logged the aircraft under the A-12 registration number. The log entries had been made by 2 people. One of them was no longer employed by the company. The other was still there. Lawson Drake appeared at the front gate of Greyhaven Estate at 7 in the morning, on foot, carrying a canvas bag and the expression of a man who had been rehearsing this arrival for a very long time. He was in his 70s, weathered in the way of people who had spent most of their lives outdoors. and he identified himself to Gideon at the gate as the last facilities manager of Greyhaven before the property was abandoned. He said he had heard the estate had a new owner. He said he had been waiting for that for 11 years. Inside the main house, over coffee that Gideon made from supplies he had brought from town, Lawson told them what he knew, not everything. He was careful to say, not the ending, because he did not know the ending, but the beginning and the middle, which he had carried alone for a long time. He said Preston had come to him in the final weeks before the disappearance and told him the company was being taken from him by degrees. Patents routed to a subsidiary structure that Vaughn had established without Preston's knowledge, board votes managed through intermediaries, the experimental division's most advanced work quietly repositioned as corporate rather than personal intellectual property. Preston had asked Lawson to prepare Greyhaven as a secure location, to move the A-12 and the 11 prototype vehicles here where they would be outside the company's physical reach, and to make sure the hangar was sealed and the car outbuilding was locked before anyone came looking. Lawson said he had done all of that. He said Preston had come to Greyhaven 3 days before the scheduled test flight, stayed for one night, and left before dawn with no details given about what he was planning, only that the flight needed to go ahead as the company expected it to, that a different aircraft would be used, and that Greyhaven needed to be sealed and left alone until his daughter was old enough to find it. Lawson said he had hoped Preston had survived for a long time, and then he had stopped hoping and simply waited long enough to see Celeste become CEO, watching from a distance to see whether she would ever come looking. She had not until Gideon Hart had bought the estate and opened the hangar. Gideon asked whether there was anything else on the property he had not told them about. Lawson set down his coffee and said there was one more thing. He said there was a second level under the hangar. Gideon found the hydraulic floor mechanism inside the hangar by feeling along the seams in the concrete, which revealed a gap running in a rectangle roughly 30 feet across. The actuator controls were panel-mounted on the interior wall, behind a steel cover plate that Lawson produced a key for from his canvas bag. When Gideon engaged the mechanism, the hydraulic system woke slowly after nearly 2 decades of dormancy, cycling through its pressure checks with a low industrial hum, before beginning to lower the central floor section on 4 scissor lift columns. The space below was larger than the main hangar, its ceiling high enough to stand in comfortably, its floor the same sealed concrete. In the center of the lower space, resting on rubber-tired stands with the precision of something positioned by someone who fully intended it to be found exactly as left, was a vehicle unlike anything in the outbuilding above. The car that bore the designation Aurelius A-12 on its instrument panel was not large by conventional standards, but it had the presence of something that had been built to solve a problem no other vehicle had attempted. Its body used materials Gideon recognized from the later cars in the outbuilding sequence, the aerospace alloys and composite reinforcement that had evolved through A01 to A11, but here they were integrated at a level of refinement that made the earlier prototypes look like developmental sketches. The drivetrain used components that Gideon could trace, part by part, to the engineering language of both the 11 cars and the 2 aircraft, a synthesis so deliberate and thorough that it was clear A01 through A11 and the 2 planes had not been built as separate programs. They had been built as components of this one, each contributing a solved problem to the vehicle that combined them all. On the instrument panel, above the ignition, 2 fields waited for input. One was labeled Prophecy. The other was labeled Elizacy. Celeste looked at the 2 fields for a long moment, and then looked at Gideon with an expression that was the most unguarded thing he had seen from her since she arrived. She said she thought the system required both of them. Gideon looked at the ignition panel and the field labeled Prophecy and understood that he was standing in front of a mechanism that Preston Ashford Sterling had designed to require the legal owner of Greyhaven and the heir of Preston himself to unlock simultaneously, not as a formality but as a structural condition, engineered to ensure that what was inside could not be taken by one without the other. Delaney was already on her phone, establishing additional documentation protocols, and Garrett Blackwood had gone very quiet in the corner of the underground garage in a way that Gideon found more interesting than anything the man had said all day. While Celeste provided her biometric input through the panel's secondary authentication, Gideon used the deed to the property, scanned to a mobile device, and verified through the county recorder's API to satisfy the first field. The Aurelius A12 completed a startup cycle that moved through its systems with the methodical patience of a machine waking after a long and deliberate sleep. It did not start completely. The primary systems came online, the instrument displays illuminated, the ventilation activated. A video display on the central console presented a progress bar and below it a message, Secondary Magi Requeel. Gideon had seen this before, not here, but in the second aircraft in the hangar above, the unfinished one, the one with components laid out along the wall. He went up the lift alone and came back with a module that matched a recessed port on the Aurelius console in both shape and the gear tooth pattern of its connector. He pressed it into the port without forcing it, felt its seat, and heard the system acknowledge the connection with a tone that had not been audible before. The display changed, the progress bar completed. A video file, compressed and stored on local media across nearly 2 decades, began to play. The man on the screen was 60-something, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that suggested a life spent outdoors and in machine shops rather than boardrooms. He spoke without preamble, as though he had already said everything he needed to say in the document preparation and was now delivering the conclusion to an audience he was not sure he would live to meet. He said that if this was playing, then the estate had found its rightful combination and the sequence was complete, and he wanted to be as clear as possible about what that meant. He described in the unhurried manner of someone who had spent years organizing his thoughts on the subject, the process by which the patents, technical documentation, and manufacturing rights associated with the Integrated Propulsion and Materials Program, represented by A01 through Aurelius. A12 had been transferred, without his authorization, through a series of subsidiary structures that his brother-in-law, Vaughn Holloway Sterling, had established using company legal infrastructure and board proxies. He said the transfers had been documented in ways designed to look like authorized corporate reorganizations, and that he had caught them late, after the most critical patents had moved, but early enough to assemble the evidence and prepare the countermeasure. The countermeasure was Greyhaven. The man on the screen said he had moved the physical prototypes here because the vehicles and aircraft themselves constituted prior art that could not be erased by a filing, and because Greyhaven, structured as a protective trust rather than a standard family property, was legally distinct from Ashford Sterling Industries' assets and could not be swept up in a corporate action. He said the collection of vehicles was not the point. The vehicles were the proof. He said he had arranged for the aircraft registration switch because he had learned his scheduled flight had been tampered with, and because he was not ready to let Vaughn conclude the problem ahead of schedule. He had left on the A12, the real one, the one now sitting one level above this recording, and he had let T07 take the designation so the investigation would close and give him time. He said he had survived the disappearance and had lived under a different identity for several years while completing the documentation and the legal framework of the trust. He said he had intended to come back. He said he had run out of time before he could. He addressed his daughter directly at the end. not as a CEO or an heir, but with the plain affection of a father who had made an impossible calculation and knew it, and had done it anyway. The video ended. The room was quiet enough that the hydraulic system's idle hum was audible. Celeste stood with her arms at her sides, and her face composed in the way of someone holding many things at once, and Gideon did not say anything because there was nothing appropriate to say. Delaney was recording the playback as admissible evidence, Brielle was annotating her technical findings with timestamps, and Lawson Drake sat against the wall and looked at the floor. Within the hour, Delaney confirmed that the trust documents embedded in the Aurelius system included a last will and testament validated by 2 independent notaries 18 years prior and filed in a sealed repository outside Virginia, with instructions for release upon authenticated activation of the system by the designated co-holders. The will granted Celeste controlling protective voting rights over a share class structured specifically to prevent transfer without the holder's consent, and it carried a deadline. It would only be effective if presented to the board before a pending corporate transaction ratified at noon the following day. Vaughn Holloway Sterling arrived at Greyhaven at 9 that evening, uninvited, and came without aggressive legal machinery, relying instead on the careful reasonableness of a man who had spent decades learning which approach worked in which situation. He was in his mid-60s, silver-templed, carrying the easy authority of someone who had sat at important tables long enough that it had become a physical characteristic. He found Gideon in the main house and addressed him with a collegial warmth that was more unsettling than hostility would have been. Vaughn said he understood Gideon had found himself at the center of something complicated, and that he respected the position Gideon had gotten into through what was clearly honest dealing. He acknowledged that the auction had been legitimate, that Gideon had acted in good faith, and that none of what had happened was Gideon's fault. He then named a figure for the property and its contents in entirety that was sufficient to change the financial character of the next several decades of Gideon's life. He said the offer would allow Gideon to open any garage he wanted, anywhere he wanted, and to take care of his daughter without the kind of financial uncertainty that legal disputes introduced into a family situation. He said this last part with the practiced sympathy of someone who had learned exactly how to make that point land. Gideon listened to all of it without interrupting, and then said that he appreciated the offer and understood the thinking behind it. He said he was not going to sell. Vaughn's expression did not change significantly, but the warmth behind it withdrew in the way that warmth withdraws from a room when the source of it has been turned off. Celeste came into the room while Vaughn was still there. The conversation that followed between them was not long, and it was conducted in the particular register of 2 people with a history of family dynamics neither had ever fully examined, who were now being forced to examine all of it at once in front of witnesses. Vaughn told her that she was letting grief compromise her judgment, that the documents she thought she had found were the product of a troubled man's final months, that the company and the family's legacy needed her to set this aside. Celeste listened to him and then told him that she was presenting the will to the board in the morning, that the transaction scheduled for noon was going to require more scrutiny than a single overnight review had provided, and that she expected the full audit she was authorized to call under the protective voting rights to begin within the week. After Vaughn left, Gideon asked her what she needed from him tomorrow. She said she needed him to walk into that boardroom with her and be exactly what he was. The person who bought Greyhaven legally, who had found everything that was there to be found, and who had not sold it. The Ashford Sterling Board of Directors convened the following morning in a conference room designed to communicate institutional weight through the quality of its furniture and the silence of its climate control. Gideon arrived in the clothes he wore to client consultations, sat between Delaney and Brielle, with Lawson Drake at the far end and Quinn as a certified expert witness, and put his copy of the auction deed on the table in front of him and waited. Vaughn opened his remarks by introducing Gideon to the assembled board with a description that stopped just short of explicit accusation, but left nothing to interpretation. A buyer of distressed property who had recognized an opportunity to leverage a family's private grief against their corporate interests. Gideon did not respond to the characterization. He waited until Garrett, who was presenting the company's legal position, had finished his overview, and then he passed to each board member in turn the county auction deed, the seal of custody documentation Delaney had prepared, the maintenance logs from the car outbuilding and the hangar, the numbered sequence of frame designations that linked A01 through A11 to the Aurelius system, and the time-stamped record of every action he had taken from the first afternoon on the property to the previous night's conversation. He said he had opened a locked door, found what was behind it, and called the people who needed to know. He said he had not sold anything, altered anything, or made any claim beyond what the auction deed entitled him to. Brielle presented the technical analysis demonstrating that the A12 in the hangar was the original prototype, that the registration substitution on TZO7 was documented in the company's own maintenance records, and that the authorization signature belonged to a current senior officer. Lawson Drake provided eyewitness testimony, the account of a man who had been present, who had carried out instructions under duress, and who had waited 11 years for a room in which to say what he knew. Delaney presented the will with its full authentication chain, the voting rights structure, the protective trust designation of Greyhaven, and the patent registration trail from the underground facility's legal files. Quinn submitted a formal valuation of the collection as prior art in the disputed patent classes, establishing independent standing for the intellectual property claims and separating them from the corporate dispute entirely. The board member who asked the pivotal question was a woman named Harriet, who had a reputation for asking what everyone else was calculating the risk of asking. She asked Quinn whether his freezing of investment positions in the pending transaction was personal or procedural. Quinn said standard practice was to pause any transaction involving assets under active ownership dispute, and that he had applied that standard. The effect was immediate. Vaughn's motion to ratify was tabled pending audit. Celeste called for the protective vote, which passed and granted her authority to require a full forensic accounting of the patent transfer subsidiary beginning immediately. Garrett, in the hour following, began formally distancing himself from Vaughn's decisions, a process the documentation made considerably more difficult than he had anticipated. The board asked Gideon, with the careful indirection that institutions use when asking uncomfortable questions, what he intended to do with Greyhaven and the collection. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when the answer is going to determine the direction of a considerable amount of money. Gideon said that he had bought a property he needed and found things he had not expected to find, and that he did not think the right answer was to dismantle something that someone had spent years assembling carefully and hiding carefully for reasons that had turned out to be good ones. He said he was open to a formal agreement that would allow the collection to remain where it was, properly documented and preserved, under an arrangement that reflected his ownership of the land and the company's legitimate interest in the vehicles and aircraft as part of its heritage. He said he had a garage to run and a daughter to raise, and no particular interest in becoming the custodian of anyone else's corporate drama. The room went quiet in the way that a boardroom goes quiet when the answer has settled, something larger than the question asked. The formal agreement took 6 weeks to draft and 2 more to execute. establishing Greyhaven Estate as an independent preservation center under a long-term lease between the land's owner and Ashford Sterling Industries. Gideon retained title to the property and operational authority over the garage and restoration facility he built in the outbuilding that had housed the 11 cars. The cars, the 2 aircraft, and the Aurelius A-12 remained at Greyhaven for authenticated inspection, ongoing research, and public exhibition on a schedule he and the company's Heritage Division jointly managed. The underground facility was sealed pending legal proceedings that moved through discovery with the efficiency of a process given an unusually complete set of documents, and the investigative machinery Delaney had set in motion was thorough, patient, and well supplied with evidence. Celeste remained as chief executive and restructured the board with the protective voting authority her father had encoded into the trust, replacing 2 seats controlled by Vaughn's network with independent directors. When she returned to Greyhaven in the months that followed, she came without the security detail, working alongside Brielle to document and conserve the unfinished second aircraft, learning the work the same way Gideon had learned the later stage engineering, by taking the time it required. On the morning the Preservation Center held its first public opening, Piper Hart was there from early in the day, moving through the car outbuilding and the hangar with the focused interest she brought to things she found genuinely worth understanding. She stopped longest in front of the Aurelius, which rested on the ground level of the hangar in the position that had been chosen for exhibition, its lines exactly as Preston had intended them, nothing added and nothing removed. She found her father at the door of the car outbuilding and asked him a question she had clearly been working up to for some time. She asked which one was worth the most, the estate, the cars, or the planes. Gideon looked back into the outbuilding at the row of vehicles standing in the clear October light, each one clean and numbered and exactly where it had been placed by someone who believed they would eventually mean something to someone who needed them to. And he told her that the most valuable thing on the property was the one thing that had managed to stay true, long enough for someone to find it before it could be destroyed or forgotten. Piper considered this answer with the seriousness she gave to answers that would take time to fully understand, and then she went back inside. Celeste was standing in front of the A-12 when Gideon found her late that afternoon, after the visitors had gone and the property had gone quiet again. She had one hand on the wing root, where the silver emblem caught the last of the day's light, and she was not looking at the aircraft the way she had on the first morning, with the stunned recognition of someone confronting an impossible fact. She was looking at it the way people look at things they have finished grieving and are learning to keep. She said she had spent 18 years thinking her father had left and taken everything with him, and that understanding he had done the opposite did not make the years easier, but it made them mean something different. Gideon said he thought that was probably what Preston had been counting on. They stood there a little longer in the late light of Greyhaven, and then the door of the underground garage, still on its hydraulic system, cycled open at the end of its evening maintenance sequence, and somewhere below the hangar floor the Aurelius A-12 sat exactly where it had waited in the dark beneath the dust for the right hands to open the right doors and call the truth by its correct name.
They got me good though, bro. Welcome in, everybody. Is there anything? Hmm. Literally, bro, just your pride. Damn, this pizza smacked. This will be my energy for a while. One minute left. I'm gonna crush the boss this next time. Welcome in, everybody. What's up, E Huag? How are you doing today, bro? Welcome in. A lot of potential here for growth. Thank you, bro. I'm pretty sure that's some form of a spam comment where you're gonna try and sell me something in a minute, but we'll find out.